Alright guys, Willem here back with a new video. In this video, I'll be reviewing the latest season of the Circle US. Circle US Season 3. Now, coming into the season, I was a bit apprehensive on how I felt about continuing watching the Circle after the UK seasons and US Season 2 that happened earlier this year, to where by the end of it, I had pretty much just lost interest in the show, and I just felt completely burnt out from the Circle. So coming into this season, I wasn't really looking forward to it, and the first few episodes did perpetuate my pessimism, largely due to the show just feeling like more of the same, which made me think, how much further can this show really hold my interest? But as we continued on with the season, I did really start to enjoy this cast, and with there being some interesting new game twists and also a lot more strategy than what we had seen in any of the US seasons up to this point, I did end up really loving this season, to where I would consider this a top tier season of the Circle at this point. But like my other reviews, obviously I got a lot to talk about, and we will be going through season episode by episode, so let's start off with the premiere, where we get more of the same from the Circle. I mean, we meet the first few players. Calvin comes in and feels like your typical Circle casting choice. Michelle comes off as likable to me, but felt like a pretty clear early boot. We then see Kay, who also seems like a typical Circle casting choice, but does end up being one of the more notable figures from this season. Matthew seemed like a fun character in his own right, but he ends up playing his best friend, Ashley, which ends up making him a lot less interesting. We then see Roxana, who was a definitely unique casting choice there. I mean, with her being Indian, but also having dwarfism. And I do think she was a good representative for those communities. We then see Daniel, who comes in as a really likable villain and reminded me a lot of Freddy from the Circle UK. We also see Nick, who comes in as this really douchey bro, but seemed to be one that would make pretty good TV. And then the last to enter was Ava, who came in as herself, but also had her sister Chanel with her, and this was a pretty humorous duo, but one that didn't seem that long for the game, especially considering how much of a trend it is on the Circle for models to be targeted early as possible catfish. And that's what ends up happening here as well, with Kay instantly thinking that she is a catfish. We do open Circle chat, and again, I don't like how they give certain players more time together than others, but I've been complaining about this for pretty much every season now, and more than likely they're not going to change it. We do instantly see a connection between Calvin and Kay, which seemed like a pretty important relationship right off the bat, and I was actually expecting them to make it to the end together, which didn't end up happening. But Calvin does end up making a big first impression with both Daniel and Ashley calling him the leader, which did make me think like, okay, maybe we could be getting some sort of Antonio or Cedric type downfall later on. And while that is essentially what we get from him, I did feel like Calvin's edit was a lot more positive along the way than theirs. Nick introduces himself with the hashtag Big Nick Energy, which I'll be lying if I were to say it didn't make me laugh. He also pretends to be this like punk drummer despite having no tattoos, which was a very suspicious choice, though it does lead to a pretty fun argument between Ava and Chanel, which in general, their dynamic was one of my favorite elements of the earlier episodes here. We then get your typical icebreaker game, which did have some pretty dumb questions, like, would you cheat in a game, like when they're playing a game? But, I mean, the question that leads to the most drama is somehow, would you let your pet kiss you in the mouth? Which throws a lot of suspicion onto Michelle, and I love Calvin's comment here where he says that she looks like a stage A dog kisser. But really, there were a lot of responses throughout this game that made me think that like certain players just don't understand how to manage their perception, where it's like, yes, like obviously Michelle has a good rationale for why she's not going to let her pets kiss her in the mouth, but when your perception is already that you have a lot of pets and you mention that in your bio, you have to play along with that perception, which I still don't get how certain people in the Circle just don't get that. But we then get to the ratings, and all of this is pretty jam-packed into this first episode, which I did personally enjoy more than last season, where we did really drag out that first elimination. But here we get right into it. Michelle, unsurprisingly, comes in last, but also unsurprisingly, Kay ends up coming in first, and we do get a twist here where she will be the sole influencer and get the sole vote to block, which I typically wouldn't like. But considering the first person booted here doesn't actually end up going home, it didn't end up bothering me too much. But we do see her blocking Ava, again kind of falling into this model curse, but this is where it gets revealed that they are not actually going home, and instead have the opportunity to clone another player, which they did this exact same thing on the Circle UK, which is kind of weird because from what I understand, this was filmed before UK Series 3. But I do feel like both these seasons have a pretty similar feel, especially at the beginning of the season, though the clone twist itself is just kind of fine. But this twist does bring a lot of drama, though I do really feel bad for the person that ends up getting cloned, and even more so in this season based on how things played out a lot more negatively for that person here than it did in the UK series. But with that, let's move on to episode 2, which entirely revolves around the clone twist, where Ava ends up deciding to clone Michelle as she was on the bottom, and this twist really does bring out more fun character moments from Ava and Chanel, with them pretending to be Southern and using phrases like "bless your heart," which feels like a joke at first, though it actually does end up getting Kay on their side, despite Kay having a really good relationship with the original Michelle. Now, Ava ends up playing Blue Michelle, while the original ends up playing Orange Michelle, and realistically, they both play really poorly here. And to me, it did feel very clear to me, based on how they were talking, that Blue Michelle was the catfish here, though the other players obviously just didn't see it that way. I mean, we do see Ava being the first to talk after a twist was revealed, and went way too hard in my opinion, talking about how she wasn't lying to them, when it's like, no one's accusing you of lying. Why are you just blatantly saying this out of nowhere? And then she also frequently uses hashtags, which the original didn't typically use. And to me, the real Michelle just sounded more authentic in her disbelief. Now, I do really feel for Michelle here, as she does constantly get picked on throughout her short run on the show. But to be honest, I did get some entertainment from her bewilderment over how someone could even clone her, with her saying they've made an enemy for life. And I did also like seeing her bonding session with Daniel, where he starts calling her Mama Michelle, though obviously that storyline doesn't have a happy ending. Get the This Is Me game, which was again another retread from UK Series 3, where they end up showing pictures from the real Michelle, and both have to tell the story behind them. And to me, the real Michelle blew this one out of the park, with so many more details, while the fake just stayed so much more general. Though we do get some humor from this, where we have this photo of Michelle in her wedding dress, where she ends up having this really old school haircut, and no one actually believes her real story, but they believe the fake story of this being her prom photo, when again, she clearly looks like she's in her 30s in this photo. It's mind-blowing to me this actually worked. Now, also in this episode, we do see the formation of the Wolf Pack, with Calvin bringing together the guys in Nick and Daniel, and it was funny to see Daniel being an outlier there. But the Calvin and Nick bromance ends up being pretty important during the early game here. Now, like in the UK version, we do also see a conversation between the two Michelles, though it really doesn't end up leading to much, and we do end the episode before the vote itself. So we do start off episode 3 with the house voting out Orange Michelle unanimously, which is just hilarious, as they're obviously wrong. But at the same time, I do feel really bad for Michelle, especially once she sees that Daniel voted for her, someone that she genuinely seemed to trust and did seem genuinely hurt over the vote. But then the show tries to make it seem like Michelle has the choice of meeting whoever she wants, when obviously the producers forced her to see the other Michelle, as again, it's better TV, but also going to anyone else would essentially just spoil the twist. So I don't get why they even pretended like this was an option for her. But the meeting itself was fine. I mean, not explosive as you would think it would have been, considering how angry Michelle had been for the entirety of the last episode. But let's talk about Michelle, who I did like for the most part. Again, I do really feel bad that everything seemed to go wrong for her and that she was grossly misunderstood. But she seems like a perfectly fine person. I mean, gameplay-wise, she obviously played poorly. I mean, she really managed her perception pretty poorly, to where she was looked at as a catfish from pretty early on, and somehow was just so ineffective in convincing everyone that she is who she is. So realistically, I don't think she had any shot of actually making a deep run on this season. And while she is technically the first boot, her run does end up being pretty notable here. But after this, we get introduced to 2 new players, both of which were catfish, which they were really lacking of in the initial group. And I feel like it felt better that way. I mean, to me, the catfish stuff with the circle has gotten a bit overplayed. Especially considering, again, like it's so irrelevant to the game that's going on itself. So it was nice to see minimal catfish early on, but here we do end up meeting Sophia, a lesbian playing as her straight older sister Isabella, and I really did like Sophia. I mean, like I know she gets a lot of flack for stuff that goes on later on. I did feel like she came into this being one of the more game-savvy players on the cast. We then also have Rachel playing as her best friend's boyfriend in Jackson, who is like a really generic looking guy. And to me, Rachel was one of the biggest non-factors on this cast, where she really didn't end up bringing much to the table, outside of the fact that pretty much everyone knew that she was a catfish. Now, they do get introduced to the other players through a new game, where everyone has to reveal a new photo, during which Roxana reveals that she is a little person, and it was nice to see the support that she got, particularly from Calvin. We do get your typical quiz game in this episode, though only Isabella and Jackson end up having to play, though the number they get correct is the number of people that they can take to the party, where we get a pretty boring party montage as they typically do on the Circle, and we do end the episode with the start of the Nick-Isabella relationship, where they create an alliance that ends up being pretty effective moving forward, though through that we do also get a lot of awkward flirting along the way. But now let's move on to episode 4, where we start off with some mundane chats, like one between those not picked for the party, though through that chat Daniel does get some good moments in his conversation with Calvin and Roxana. We do have Ashley and Nick solidify their bond and want to bring Isabella in, which is kind of the formation of the band alliance that we see later on. We have an awkward chat between the fake Michelle and Kay, where they end up talking about boys, which for Ava and Chanel, this seemed to be really poor play, as again, they just did not sound like a 50-year-old woman here. But the main intrigue for the episode starts with the honest review game, where each player has to anonymously write a review of another player. And it was nice to see the majority of these being negative, where I feel like on most seasons we see maybe 1 or 2 negative comments. But here, all the ones that were shown were negative. Now, obviously, a few people didn't get shown at all, and I'm sure those were probably positive, and that's probably why they weren't shown. But Calvin ends up getting a lot of focus here for being too domineering, where Ashley and Jackson both call him out for that. Isabella calls Nick out for his flirting tactics. Nick goes for Kay, calling her a fake friend. Kay goes for Daniel, to which I felt bad for him, as it did seem to really upset him. But again, that's a decent amount of negative reviews there. Now afterwards, Daniel does reach out to Roxana, to where they end up really solidifying their bond. We do also see Isabella and Ashley bonding over their real selves while they're both playing catfish, where like Isabella mentions that her sister is gay, meaning herself, and Ashley tells a pretty emotional story that actually comes from his own real experience. And to me, this really shows how much more interesting Ashley or Matt would have been if he had came in playing as his true self over playing the catfish that ends up being kind of stale. Now, beyond this, the rest of the episode focuses on the ratings, where we do have Michelle coming in last once again. Calvin ends up having a massive drop to 5th place, while Roxana and Kay end up being the influencers. And I really never had any doubt that Michelle was going home here, especially after one of the last few things we saw before the ratings was how Kay was getting suspicious of Michelle being the one to give her a negative review. But we do end the episode with the reveal that the blocking will be done face to face, and Kay ends up arriving at Michelle's, aka Ava and Chanel's apartment, meaning that we ended this block of episodes knowing who had been blocked, unlike the next batch. But let's talk about Ava and Chanel here. I really loved their dynamic on this season. I really found them to be fun characters, with them getting into a lot of humorous arguments. And to be honest, if it was just Ava on her own, it probably would have been kind of boring, as I do feel like what made her interesting was her reactions to Chanel, or following whatever Chanel was doing. While Chanel is someone that I do think is a legitimately fun character and did seem to be the more domineering of the two, and someone that would have been just fun on her own. But even then, I do think she was a character that was still booned by having Ava there to play off of. Now, from a gameplay standpoint, they were both pretty terrible at the game, and seeing them navigate as a catfish was pretty fun, with their numerous missteps along the way, and that probably made them the highlight of this first week. And the season does kind of make a turn after their elimination to be a lot more focused around the gameplay over this like saga of Michelle and Ava and Chanel. Now for episode 5, which starts off with Kay meeting up with Ava and Chanel, which was a largely uneventful meetup outside of the revelation that they ended up booting the original Michelle earlier. And in Ava and Chanel's final message, they essentially end up throwing Kay under the bus, which starts this major storyline of Kay being suspected as a catfish that essentially becomes the main storyline for this batch of episodes, with Nick getting a lot of content over wanting to target her. We also get the setup for this Calvin-Jackson rivalry, with Nick trying to add Jackson to the wolf pack, and Calvin instantly suspecting him as a catfish, with Rachel end up playing the pretty stereotypical catfish here, with her not giving away much information. In this episode, we also see the OG women make an alliance, which becomes a pretty important one for Kay moving forward, especially coming into the next blocking. We do also see the formation of one of the major alliances on the season in the band, which allows Nick to essentially take over the game, with him adding in the two new players in Isabella and Jackson into his already made alliance with Ashley, which was humorous to see that Nick ends up actually making an alliance with the three catfish in the game. But this alliance does end up being a major strategic force within this season that, while it doesn't have the most likable people within it, I did end up rooting for this alliance because it did feel like they were actually trying to play this as a game, which we just don't see that often on The Circle. The major event for this episode was the Circle rap battle, which was hosted by Lil Yachty, who I've never heard of. But, he's a rapper, I guess. And the players have to write a diss track about each other. And this entire segment was really dumb. Though it did end up causing some drama with, surprisingly, these set-up rivalries getting put up against each other. Calvin calling Jackson out as a catfish. And Nick ends up doing the same thing to Kay as well. But really, most of these raps were just pretty cringy. And to have Lil Yachty be the one to judge them and him reciting the raps on his own was also really bizarre. And we do also get a bit of an awkward end to the episode, where the last thing we see is Calvin and Kay flirting, which added to me thinking that they were going to be a really important relationship for this season. Though looking back on it, it's more likely that this was shown here because, obviously their relationship on the show is about to end, and this is the last opportunity for them to show it. And now for episode 6, which really just continues on more of the same storylines at first. We already see a conversation between Calvin and Jackson. That was pretty awkward, with Jackson being really cagey still and Calvin still being clearly annoyed at him. But then Jackson just abruptly leaves the chat, so that was kind of funny. We do have a chat between Nick and Kay that further cements their rivalry. And we do later see Nick and Isabella continue to talk about how dangerous Kay is, which leads us into the ratings. But before we do also get a new player in James, who ends up being one of the best characters and players on this season. It is a real shock to me that he wasn't an initial player, though I guess they wanted to leave a really good cast member as a late entrant. Maybe that was their thought process. But he's such a massive presence on the show, and when he enters the game, he gets to add people to his chat in batches based on his first impressions, and right off the bat he does build a bond with Kay that ends up being one of his strongest relationships moving forward. It is also funny how Calvin tries to pump up Nick to James, only for James to end up picking Nick last, and it was fun to see how Nick finally gets to join and starts writing his message, only for the chat to close before he's able to send it. And really, this is just fun to see the producers messing with him there. But then we get to the ratings, where we do see the band go into action, with them voting together here and getting 2 band members into the influencer spots, with Isabella and Ashley becoming the influencers, which made it pretty clear that the boot was going to be either Kay or Calvin. But again, the edit did lean towards it being Calvin, with him again getting a similar edit to other boots around this point in the game. Though again, I wasn't fully expecting one of these two to go, with their relationship being so prominent up to this point, but these results made it really obvious that it was going to happen. And we do end up seeing Ashley clearly wanting to keep Kay around due to their women's alliance, and Isabella didn't really have a great rebuttal for why to not get rid of Calvin. That again made it clear where this was going, and I do think this is a pretty good strategic move for Ashley here. Obviously it's nothing too innovative, like this is a very basic strategy move from any social strategy game, and while I don't think she takes full advantage of it moving forward, it does set herself up pretty well here, as it puts Ashley right in the middle of the game, while also giving Nick less options moving forward. But we do end the episode on a cliffhanger of who's going to be blocked, though again it ends up being Calvin. So let's just talk about Calvin here, who I did like on the show. Again, he had a similar run to that of like Antonio or Cedric as this domineering figure early on that does end up getting targeted immediately afterwards. But unlike them, I did feel like he had more to give on this season. Again, I did feel like those other two both had very solid downfall story arcs, while I don't feel like Calvin's was as blatant here. Again, he does have this relationship with Kay that did feel like it was going to last until the end, but it just doesn't. I mean, he does seem like a nice enough guy, and I did like how his boot here did really kick this season into overdrive from a strategic standpoint, where from this point forward, there are two clear-cut sides going after each other. So in a way, I do look at his boot here as a sacrifice for giving us a much more dynamic season. But now let's get to episode 7, where again, Calvin is blocked and ends up meeting up with Kay, which I found to be a very awkward scene, with Calvin clearly wanting a like Joey and Miranda style meetup, but Kay clearly is not into doing that on the show, so it was a bit cringy to watch. But Calvin does end up telling her to work with Nick, which I do think played a major factor in their future reconciliation. But this is also where we get a new twist, one that actually wasn't in the UK version, where Calvin gets to choose on his way out to give someone the power of popularity, which you would think it would be something ratings related, like an automatic influencer, but no, it ends up being the power to create a burner profile that you can use to gather and spread information, essentially now making this player play as two people. And I did like this twist to the game. It is something that is pretty simple here, but we just haven't seen it been attempted before. And I do think it leads to some pretty interesting TV, especially with Calvin giving it to Nick, who really plays into this role pretty well, where he does have to play as Vince, this creepy looking ghost hunter. And I just love how the circle hands out these really ridiculous profiles to people whenever they create one, and this one felt like probably the most ridiculous one we've seen up to this point. Again, there's like no way that people could actually believe Vince was a real person, right? Even though, again, the show shows it as if they do, which is just mind-blowing. But it's again, like you're seeing Vince and you're like, that guy's definitely a catfish. But again, it was fun to see Nick have to manage two profiles and having to run to different rooms to play as different characters and putting on a cape while playing as Vince, which all felt like this was clearly on the direction of production, with them telling him to do this so that the viewer can differentiate who he's playing as. But again, this does lead to some fun. I mean, Nick does add Vince to the wolf pack, so I mean, that's something. We do get this weird campfire segment where Nick has to tell a ghost story as Vince, and again, it's fun to see Nick running back and forth between his two campfires. But we also do get some interesting gameplay here as well with the Calvin move, making the opposition realize that there is another side. So we do see Kay and Roxana end up adding Daniel and James to their alliance, planning on targeting Jackson, which I do feel like is a strategic misstep, as what is Jackson doing? But I did like how James was so easily able to take over Calvin's spot in the alliance. And we do end the episode with Kay and Nick reconciling and making a truce that does end up playing a major role moving forward, obviously. Now for episode 8, which starts off with a cake decorating game that we've seen multiple times on numerous seasons, and it was funny to see Nick have to end up making 2 cakes, with him deciding to make Vince's directed at himself, which I felt like was a pretty big misstep here, to where I do think it increases the target on Nick's back by making it seem like he got Nick on his side so quickly. But also, once it's revealed that Vince is a burner account, wouldn't that be a major clue into who the real person was there? So I do feel like this was a bit of a mistake from my point of view. But this game also leads to the first public display of how popular Nick has become, where Ashley and Isabella, along with Vince obviously, all end up making cakes for Nick. And we do later see that this does put a target on his back, with both Daniel and Roxana talking about targeting him. While at the same time, it did seem to also make James want to reach out to Nick, as he looked at him as a well-connected player. So really, at the end of the day, there are positive and negative side effects to this move. Now both Daniel and Kay do also end up making cakes for Roxana, which I do think also puts a target on her back moving forward, making her seem like the glue to their alliance. We do also have Nick telling Isabella about his truce with Kay, to which Isabella is greatly annoyed, to which I might as well talk about Isabella's obsession over Kay, which had been very prominent in the last few episodes. where most of Isabella's content goes to her complaining about whatever Kay is doing. And I know this did lead to some vitriol online and even some people calling her racist, which is never the read I personally got from this. I mean, Isabella clearly wanted to work with Kay early on, but they never end up seeming to talk. And instead, I do think she looked at Kay as her biggest threat in the game. And again, with Kay also being a person that has been influencer 2 times in a row and clearly has a lot of influence in the game with a lot of close personal relationships, I do think Isabella picked up on that. And it did something that we do see all the time on Big Brother and even at points on Survivor, where you villainize your biggest threat in the game and probably associate them with more agency than they really deserve. And that is what this came off as to me, more so than any true personal hatred towards her. Now moving forward, we do also have the final conversation that Vince ends up making in the game, where Nick uses Vince in order to talk to Kay about himself, which didn't seem to get him that much. But the show really tries to hype this up though. But the rest of the episode is focused on the ratings, where the two sides end up voting for each other, with the band having a slight advantage, leading to Kay being at the bottom, followed by Isabella, and then back and forth between alliances until we get to the top, where Nick becomes first place alongside Daniel, which is where we get the twist that instead of having to agree on who to block, they're going to end up blocking one player each, which I did feel like was underwhelming here, as this was really set up to be a really interesting debate between the two of like who's going to give up first. And the fact that we don't see that is kind of disappointing, but also the episode ends on the reveal of this twist, meaning we have to wait an entire week to find out who was blocked, unless you won't watch the preview where they accidentally spoiled it, which made this cliffhanger even more pointless. But with that, let's move on to episode 9, where we do get to the blockings, where Daniel has to block first, and he ends up unsurprisingly blocking Jackson, which had been set up over the course of the last few episodes with him thinking that he was a catfish, though I do feel like this was a bit of a misstep again. I think the optimal move here would have probably been to take out Isabella, who seemed to be a bit more of the glue for the other alliance. Though realistically, I don't think it really ends up mattering that much, as long as you take out a number for the opposite side. But then Nick gets the opportunity to block again after seeing who Daniel picked. And coming out of the last episode, I did think there was actually a decent chance of Kay being taken out here due to the amount of setup that we got for it, while there wasn't really any setup for a Roxana boot. Despite the fact that I do think the Roxana boot would have been the optimal move for him to make, but I was a bit hesitant on whether or not it was going to happen based on the amount of setup that was shown on the show. But just based on Roxana's general edit as a whole, it did make sense for her to be taken out here. And he does end up doing so, which again, I do think was the right call. Roxana is someone that is pretty blatantly the glue between Kay and Daniel. She's also someone that has basically no relationship with Nick and was directly targeting him, and also allows him to keep Kay around, someone he has to deal with, while also weakening her in the game. So really all of this made Roxana seem like a no-brainer move here. But both Jackson and Roxana obviously get to meet someone on the way out, with Jackson surprisingly meeting Nick, which kind of comes out of left field, though afterwards it definitely feels like she was obviously interested in him and just couldn't say anything beforehand due to being catfish, and kind of used this as an opportunity to talk to him, while Roxana ends up meeting Daniel, which I felt like was a pretty heartwarming meeting there, with the two seeming to have a genuine bond, though they do end up being pissed at Nick for voting out Roxana here, despite them both openly talking about wanting to target him, which felt hypocritical, but either way. But let's talk about the block players, starting off with Jackson, also known as Rachel, who was pretty boring. Probably the biggest dud on the cast in my eyes, especially considering she had a decent amount of time here to make an impact on the show, but ended up just simply being pretty dull. Again, another situation where I think if Rachel had just played as herself, she probably would have had a bit more intrigue on the show as a character, though the person she was playing here really just had no personality. Now, I do think Rachel seemed to be pretty self-aware of that, though, with her even pointing out that Jackson was boring and rode the fence too much, but she just never did anything about it, and in the grand scheme of things, she's probably one of the more forgettable figures from this season. Then we have Roxana, who I was expecting to make a lot more of an impact than she ended up making, where again she represents numerous communities and seemed to be a big character on the offset, but she doesn't end up being as prominent in the edit as most other characters, and in general seemed to be someone that took everything so seriously. And because of that, it did lead to some fun reactions to things, but also led to some annoyances from the aspect that she seemed to genuinely struggle with separating game from personal. Though again, she seems like a great person in real life, but probably not someone that is suited to play a social strategy game. Now, after their departures, we do get another departure where Vince gets blacked out and the twist is revealed, and I was mind blown that most people didn't just suspect Nick, with only James and Kay being shown to have done so. And even afterwards, he ends up talking to Kay, where he ends up pacifying her and reassures her to where she ends up believing him. So again, I'm surprised this didn't end up backfiring on Nick here. We also get a conversation between James and Ashley here, where James opens up to Ashley, and this does end up being pretty important to future blockings, considering that James is an influencer from this point forward. But the main event of the episode ends up being the arrival of the final new player, with that being Jackie. And I mean, I don't love that they continue to add people here in this last batch of episodes. Again, add someone this late into the game. It never felt like she had any real shot, and because of that, she just ends up being fodder on the season. But with the alliances being split 3v3 at this point, Jackie does end up being a pretty important swing vote in the upcoming round, and it was a lot of fun to see the two sides try to court her. And we get a lot of awkward pandering to her in the opening circle chat, with like Nick calling her the most well-rounded person he has ever met in his life, which is just a ridiculous thing to say. But James ends up being the one to do the best work here, to where she instantly looks at him as her closest ally, and this ends up putting James in a power position moving forward. Now, the episode does end with the Circle of Fortune game, where Jackie has to pick players to answer specific questions, which does lead to some drama as Ashley picks Kay as her biggest rival, causing a feud between those two. And the same thing also happens for James picking Isabella as the most likely catfish. And I did find it weird how that question was used as the cliffhanger for this episode, as it really leads to nothing. But with that, let's move on to episode 10, where, again, we see more of the courting of Jackie, where we do see James have a private chat with her and gives her a rundown of the house dynamics that Jackie ends up just eating up. And again, James does do some really good work here in getting Jackie on his side. And following this, we do get a pretty fun moment where both alliances at the same time end up trying to start a group chat with Jackie to pull her to their side, and she has to make a decision right there. And due to all the work that James had put in the previous night, Jackie does end up declining the band and sides with Viva la Revolution, also known as James, Kay, and Daniel. And this entire situation was very reminiscent to me of the Circle France and how that game ended up playing out, where we had a very similar situation of a 3v3 with the last player coming in being the swing. Though I actually feel like this season's endgame actually played out a lot more interesting than the way that the Circle France's did. Now, after that chat, Jackie does eventually talk to Nick as well, where I do think he does effective work as well. That ends up booning him in the game, as it allows him to remain high enough on her ratings to end up being an influencer anyway. Now, during this episode, we do also see Isabella apologizing to Kay after realizing how obsessed she had been with her up to this point, to which I think Kay does decent work here, to where Isabella talks about wanting Kay in the band now. But then we get to the ratings, where, like in the previous round, it is back and forth between alliances, but with the band this time being the lower ranked alliance. And really, at the end of the day, it does feel like Jackie becomes the decision maker here, with James clearly being her number one and ending up in first place. But the fight for the second influencer was pretty interesting here, and again, really does have the potential to change up the entire game. But as I said, I do think Nick's good work with Jackie keeps him in the number 2 spot here, and we do end the episode with Nick and James going to the hangout, with this being set up to be a pretty interesting deliberation, as it is essentially coming down to which alliance was as strong as the other, which again is what we were set up in the Nick and Daniel deliberation earlier. That didn't end up actually happening here. This time we actually get to see it. And with that, let's start talking about episode 11, where we do get to see this really fun battle between Nick and James on who's going to give in first. I mean, they started by agreeing to keep both Kay and Isabella safe, narrowing it down to Ashley and Daniel. And Nick does a pretty good job in throwing Daniel under the bus, making up a lie about how many alliances he has been in. And through that, and also James just naturally having a stronger personal bond with Ashley than Daniel, James ends up giving in here and turns against Daniel. But also along the way, he creates a deal with Nick to keep himself and Kay safe in the next round, which could have easily backfired on him. But I did like that he had the forethought to make this deal, as again, it's something we rarely see on the Circle. But I did also love the gameplay from Nick here, where he does end up getting his way. And this was just all a fun sequence of events, and It was interesting to see James to be the one to type this out as well. That does cause Daniel to think that he's safe until the name is eventually written out. And he is the one that is blocked, which does lead to some pretty big reactions on both sides of the spectrum. But Daniel does get to meet someone before he leaves, and I was surprised to see that he picked Isabella, which I guess he picked her to see if she was a catfish, but it does kind of come out of left field, though they do have a fun meetup where Daniel ends up throwing Ashley and James on their bus, and they did seem to have a fun dynamic there. But let's talk about Daniel, who I really did like on this season. Again, right off the bat, he did remind me of Freddy from UK Series 1, with his loud, whiny, and antagonistic nature. But Daniel did a much better job at managing his perception, it seemed. Again, like he was so easily able to play this like young, naive kid, not really getting in trouble, and seemed to be well liked by the majority of the house, though he did seem to struggle with making lasting bonds, to where, as we even saw here, that James chose a member of the opposing alliance over him because he didn't feel as connected to Daniel. I think that is obviously a massive knock against Daniel's game here, but he is still a fun character on this season, and someone I definitely thought had a chance at winning by the time he was booted here. Now, after blocking, we do get James and Kay reconciling, with him explaining why he took out Daniel. The band also ends up chatting and celebrate that Nick saved them, to which we see Ashley call Nick Daddy Nick for the first time in chat, something that he's been saying on his own for a while. And I will say, I just found this to be really creepy, and also seemed to be a massive tell that Ashley was a catfish, though it seemed like no one really caught on to that. But we also get the Circle Yearbook game, which was really uneventful. But to go along with that, we also get the Circle Prom, where they get this really typical party, obviously, of them awkwardly dancing by themselves, and all this was pretty boring. We had a conversation between Ashley and Kay, where they seemingly repaired their relationship, and they get pretty emotional while doing so. Jackie also gets an emotional scene, talking about her brother's death. But overall, I'll be honest, I did find the majority of this episode, especially the back half of this episode, to be pretty dull. Though we do end the episode with the reveal that tomorrow will be the final blocking. And with that, let's move on to episode 12, which mostly revolves around the final blocking. But before that, we do waste a lot of time. I mean, we get messages from home, which were mostly boring, but it did give some strong personal content for James, which did make me think of him as the winner from an edit standpoint, at least, with him having a similar endgame stretch here of personal content in a similar way to Delisa from season 2, despite the fact that his path seemed pretty tough based on the layout of the house coming into the final ratings. We do also get the Savage Questions game, which is your typical game for before the final blocking, where they get to anonymously ask questions, and this was largely uneventful, but I did feel like Kay in particular gave a pretty bad answer to who she thought was the least deserving, where she clearly is inferring Jackie but doesn't specifically say anyone, which is really the worst of both worlds. We do get a couple convos before the ratings where Nick, James, and Kay solidify their deal, and also we do see Jackie being worried that her alliance isn't intact after the last blocking, but for some reason goes back to that broken alliance instead of trying to get insulated within the other alliance that seemed to be more intact. So I felt like that was pretty suboptimal play. But then we get to the ratings where we find out that we are getting the super influencer, but with a pretty massive twist I did enjoy watching, which was that instead of one super influencer, we were going to get two super influencers that were kept a secret and remained anonymous during their deliberation. And I felt like this was pretty fun, especially when we have a retread of the last influencers with James and Nick facing off once again, but this time not even knowing who they're facing off with. And I did like this dynamic of them trying to figure out who they're debating with and them also trying to pretend to be someone else in order to try to get their way. And supposedly this went on for 6 hours, which just sounds ridiculous, but I did find it impressive how Nick once again gets his way in getting James to take out Jackie, which seemed to be a pretty bad move for James, with Jackie being the type of person who would very clearly put him in first place after final blocking, though also maybe that added to the perception that led to him getting some higher ratings from the people outside of his alliance. So it could go either way and really just shows how high variance the endgame of the circle is. But either way, he does end up having to lose that relationship here and does have the blocker face to face, which was largely uneventful. But let's talk about Jackie, who was fine. Again, someone that clearly had no shot on this season with her being added so late in her edit, not really screaming out to me as a winner. I think she would have been a lot more interesting had she joined from the beginning, and probably would have done decently well, as she did seem to get along with everyone there and did build that really strong bond with James really quickly in the game. And while it did seem like she was lacking any semblance of a strategic mind in the game, I do think she could have potentially done well, but again, for this season, never really had that much faith in her. But with that, let's move on to the finale, which I thought was pretty fun. I mean, to me, this is probably the best finale the Circle US has had. I mean, like normal, we do waste some time early on in the episode with them getting a foot bath for some reason. We do also get the Jackie blocking reveal. We get their final chat in the game, which is mostly just them celebrating. But then we get to the final ratings, where it did seem like a good chunk of them were voting strategically, at least to a degree, where despite Nick being one of the most popular players up to this point, Isabella ends up putting Ashley in first instead. Ashley puts him in third, which again made it pretty clear to me that Nick had no chance at winning here, which was disappointing considering his otherwise pretty dominant performance. I did find it interesting how outside of Kay putting James first, we didn't really see any other James placements, which did make me think that he was probably going to pull it out here, especially with his edit coming into the finale. Even though logically, I did feel like Ashley was in the best spot to win here. And we do see her getting rated pretty highly here too. So, I mean, that was also a realistic possibility. But again, for me, the edit always leaned towards James. We do then get to the final dinner, which I found to be pretty fun as well. I mean, I feel like most recent ones have been pretty underwhelming, but I did like seeing all of these pretty likable figures interacting here with Nick and Isabella meeting for first time and her like seeming to hyperventilate when coming in. I found it funny how she had to talk about why she played as Isabella multiple times over the course of this dinner. James comes in and brings his fun energy as well. We have Kay coming in and reconciling with Sophia. And then they save Ashley for last, to which we get a pretty massive reaction. And again, I found this sequence to be pretty fun. I mean, not as notable as like UK Series 1, but to me, that's like one of the best moments in all of reality television. So I still found this one to be pretty strong. And I did like the reunion here as well, where they had the players enter one by one. We got to see the reactions from pretty much everyone when they saw a new catfish come in. And I did find it funny to see Jackie enter and like Calvin continuously asking like, who is this? Who is this? I also found it cringy how much they were trying to set up Nick and Rachel and Kay and Calvin. But again, I really did like seeing this cast interact here. That did make this reunion pretty fun. But then we get to the results, where Nick ends up coming in last, which was a shock to me. I did feel pretty confident he wasn't winning, but I was expecting him to come in probably like third or fourth, definitely not fifth. We then see Kay and Isabella go out next, as I expected, and we got to the exact final two that I was expecting of James versus Ashley, aka Matthew, and James does pull it out here, which again, I saw from an edit standpoint, but I don't feel like the show properly explained exactly why he wins, considering it's so weird that we get so much strategic ratings in terms of putting Nick low, but like, why didn't they do the same thing for James when James was also an influencer very recently, and like they don't know he was 2 times in a row, but they at least know he was a recent influencer, so that felt kind of weird to me. But we do end the season here pretty similarly to last season, where James ends up calling his girlfriend and telling her that he won, and that was a nice moment to see. And overall, I am pretty satisfied with the outcome of this season. I mean, while James did make some suboptimal moves at points, I still find James to be really likable, and I do think he's a pretty strategic player. And if it wasn't going to be Nick as the winner here, I did feel like James was the next best option. Before wrapping up the season, I do want to talk about the finalists, starting off with Nick, who is probably the best player in the history of the Circle in terms of getting to the end. I mean, again, to me, the final ratings of the Circle are so high variance that it's almost impossible to truly gauge how it's going to go. But I do think Nick played pretty dominantly up until that point. I mean, he created the dominant alliance of the season in the band, manipulated James into getting rid of both Daniel and Jackie, and did so while also being a really fun character along the way. I mean, yes, he did start off as this like really cocky douche, but I did find him to be pretty fun by the end of it, with him getting a mountain of screen time in the end game there. Clearly, Nick was one of the stars of the show here. And with that, let's talk about another star of the show, and that is Kay, who, again, another massive character and player on this season. I mean, she really was the standout of the show after week 1. And I felt like she was in it for the long haul from that point. Though I will say that I do feel like once Calvin leaves, it did feel like her edit became a lot less prominent, where most of her storyline from that point forward is in relation to Nick and James, who are both getting much bigger edits by that point in the season. But Kay still did have a notable run here and is definitely one of the more memorable figures from this season. Next up, we do have Isabella, or Sophia, who I did like over the course of the season. Like, again, I know a lot of people found her annoying, especially with her obsession with Kay, but I did like her from the offset. I found her to be pretty relatable with her insecurities and her at least trying to play strategically. Again, I do think she ended up mixing that in with emotions at points, but I did like that she tried to play the game strategically. But I mean, really, that goes for pretty much everyone here in the final five. Though I will say that she would have been a pretty underwhelming winner in my eyes. I do think she was probably the person that I wanted to win the least, but still a figure that I did like to have on this season. Next up, we have Ashley, or Matthew, who I did really like Matthew, though, again, for most of the season, I didn't find him to be particularly interesting, where it feels like he got overshadowed by people like Nick and Calvin and Kay and James, who just have massive edits, and Matthew just wasn't as prominent, though it did seem like the entire cast loved him and called him one of the funniest players there. So I do feel like there's probably just something lost in translation or lost in the edit. But as a player, I do think he played the role of the catfish pretty perfectly, to where no one suspected him the entire time and was still able to allow his personality to shine to the players in the game. And he does come into the final ratings being in a pretty perfect position of not being too big of a threat while also having really good relations with everyone there. And it also makes some strategic moves, particularly the Calvin boot. So I do think he is also another pretty strong player from this season. But now let's talk about the winner of the season in James, who, again, I did really like on this season. And despite him being a late entrant into the game, it did feel like we got to know him better than really the majority of the cast here, especially with how much focus he got in that penultimate week, with his relationship with Kay and Jackie being such major storylines and him becoming an influencer 2 times in a row. And we also got a lot of personal content about him and how much he needs the money, and we heard about his brother, and to me it really felt like they were setting him up as a winner here. And I did feel like he played pretty well as well for the most part. Again, like, he created strong personal bonds right away. He did look at the game through a strategic lens. Now again, he did make some missteps in allowing Nick to get his way, particularly with the Jackie elimination, but he wins despite that. So I do find him to be a satisfying winner for the season from both a gameplay and a character standpoint. And with that said, we've reached the end of the season, and overall, I really did love the Circle US Season 3. I mean, to me, there is an argument for this being the best season of the show ever. I mean, it is a great mix of fun characters, interesting twists, and a decent amount of gameplay that we rarely see from the Circle. And for me, it has a lot of similarities to the Circle France, but I feel like this season's better than it in every single way. So the only other season to compare it to, in my opinion, is UK Series 1, which is a more iconic season, definitely has a lot more notable moments, but I do think this season was a lot more consistent and probably does end up surpassing it. I mean, I really did adore this season by the end of it, though it does have a bit of a slower start than I would have liked, but it was still not entirely bad. Again, to me, it's clearly the best of the US series, and again, possibly best of all time. Well, with that, that is my review of the Circle US Season 3. Now, moving on, the Circle has been confirmed to be coming back for at least 2 more seasons. So obviously, I'll be covering those down the road. Obviously, stay tuned for more reality TV content, video game content, whatever else I decide to make. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.